By January 1943, Leningrad had been cut off for nearly 17 months. Every attempt to reach it had failed. Entire Soviet armies had been destroyed in the forests south of the city. Operation Iskra was meant to correct that. Two fronts would strike the same corridor at the same hour from opposite directions, and the timing had to be just perfect. If they failed again, Leningrad would face another winter of starvation, and the Soviet High Command would have no forces left to try again. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, one of the most tantalizing objectives in the north was Leningrad, modern-day St. Petersburg. The city held major shipyards, factories, and, above all, the headquarters of the Baltic Fleet. By early autumn, German forces had reached the outskirts, and with their allies, the Finnish forces advancing from the north, closed nearly every land route leading in or out of Leningrad. As the year neared its end, the city became completely isolated, with more than 2 million civilians and soldiers trapped behind a front line that sat only a few miles from the suburbs. The only remaining link to the rest of the Soviet Union ran across Lake Ladoga, a broad inland lake northeast of the city. This was the last supply route. During the brutal Russian winters, trucks moved across its frozen surface, while in the warmer months small convoys crossed the same stretch by boat. However, with so many people trapped, the few supplies that did reach Leningrad were often far below planned levels, leading to mass starvation. Militarily, the situation was equally difficult. By the fall of 1942, the trapped Soviet units defending the city had been fighting without interruption for over a year. Ammunition and fuel were rationed, equipment wore out faster than it could be replaced, and many formations were a ghost of what they once were. Several attempts to break the siege ended in complete failure, usually because the separate Soviet commands around the region simply did not coordinate their attacks or concentrate enough strength in one place. As the year neared its end, everyone in the Soviet High Command, the Stavka, understood that Leningrad could not continue under these conditions. By then, the wider war was also shifting, with German forces heavily engaged at Stalingrad, and their ability to reinforce the northern sector now limited. This unique set of circumstances presented a narrow window for a more focused effort to open a land corridor once and for all. Operation Iskra. With Iskra, Russian for spark, the Stavka concluded that a coordinated effort between the two major formations positioned around the city was the only way to relieve Leningrad. These two large fronts, composed of several armies and their supporting artillery, engineers and air units, were the Leningrad Front under General Leonid Govorov, commanding the units inside the siege, and the Volkov Front under General Kirill Meretskov, holding the ground east of the German positions. The two units were polar opposites. Govorov's Leningrad Front had spent the past year holding a fixed perimeter, with many units far below strength after months of limited resupply. Even so, they operated on familiar ground and could shift artillery and infantry along short interior routes inside the city. Meanwhile, Meretskov's Volkov front outside the encirclement was in much better shape logistically, but its men carried the scars of the earlier Lyuban offensive, a 1942 operation that attempted to reach Leningrad from the east, but ended with the Second Shock Army cut off and destroyed in the wooded marshland south of the city. Rebuilding the force took time, and several divisions entered the winter with fewer experienced officers and reduced equipment. For the coming operation, Stavka reinforced both fronts with rifle divisions, artillery, and engineers, so the next attempt would be coordinated, concentrated, and strong enough to hit the target, a narrow, German-held corridor southeast of Lake Ladoga, held by elements of the German 18th Army, supported by well-placed artillery, strong fieldworks, and interlocking positions that covered nearly every approach. It was difficult to outflank and, even harder, to penetrate. But it was also the one place where a Soviet breakthrough had a realistic chance of success. The plan required both fronts to strike at the same time, push through the gap, and meet near Workers' Village number 1 or number 8, two small pre-war settlements that the Germans had converted into strongpoints. With the new year blossoming, Operation Iskra opened on January 12, 1943, when both Soviet fronts began their push into the narrow Shlisselburg-Sinyavino corridor, named for the settlements at either end. Although they were working toward the same objective, the two formations stood a considerable distance apart, separated by roughly 6 to 7 miles of German-held ground. Now, each front had its own sector to fight through before there was any chance of linking up. Neither force could complete the corridor alone, so both advances had to move in step for the plan to work. On the western side, led by General Govorov, the Leningrad front slowly crossed the frozen Neva River and moved toward Shlisselburg, a small town that sat on the southern tip of Lake Ladoga and controlled the northern entrance to the gap. Though capturing it would open a path along the lake shore for a future supply route, advance was slow from the beginning, with deep snow limiting movement to a few narrow approaches, all reinforced with minefields, trenches and gun positions built into ruined buildings. On the eastern side, the outsiders led by General Meretskov, the Volkov front, attacked west toward a cluster of workers' settlements that formed the very center of the German line, standing on slightly higher, firmer ground within the frozen marshes. Soviet troops advancing through this sector had to do the grueling work of going through belts of wire, bunkers, and strongpoints arranged to cover the few usable access routes through the forest and swamp. By the evening of January 14th, though they had punched through the outer defenses on opposite sides of the corridor, several miles of fortified ground remained between them. By January 15th, the German corridor began to buckle. The Leningrad front reached the outskirts of Shlisselburg and forced the defenders back toward Lake Ladoga's shore. The town anchored the northern end of the passage, and any Soviet foothold there threatened the entire German line from above. As the infantry pushed closer, the defenders tried to fall back, but the narrow terrain left little room to adjust. At the same time, the Volkov front broke into Workers' Village number 8, the fortified settlement holding the middle of the German corridor. This gain widened the breach and pulled German reserves toward the center, further weakening their response near Shlisselburg. Fighting in the town sharpened the next day as Soviet units entered damaged streets and industrial buildings. From there, the same Volkov formations pushed deeper through the settlements so more rifle divisions and supporting guns could move forward. German counterattacks hit where possible, but each fallback shortened the distance between the two Soviet thrusts. The corridor had no depth, and once both its top and center were under strain, there was no ground left for the Germans to form a new line. Shlisselburg fell on the 17th, breaking the German grip along the lakeshore. As Soviet forces advanced a little farther through the settlements, the gap between the two spearheads shrank to a short stretch of frozen ground. With the top broken and the center collapsing, the corridor could no longer hold. The final break came the next morning. Lead elements of the Leningrad front moved out from Shlisselburg as formations from the Volkov front advanced from the workers' settlements. By late morning, their forward companies reached the same stretch of frozen ground near Workers' Village number 1 and linked their lines. The junction created an unbroken Soviet front from the Neva River to Lake Ladoga and opened a land route 5 to 6 miles wide. For the first time since 1941, Leningrad was connected to the rest of the country by ground. Once the ground was secure enough for support units to enter, engineer battalions and rail teams moved into the gap to establish a dependable supply route before the Germans could regroup. Over the next few days, after the infantry widened the corridor for staging areas and artillery, engineers began laying a narrow-gauge rail line along the southwestern shore of Lake Ladoga. Even before the line was finished, small columns of trucks and horse-drawn sleds began moving supplies along the new track. Although the siege would continue for another year, in the weeks that followed, the rail line was completed, and the first trains entered the city in early February. Supply flow increased at once. Food, fuel, and ammunition reached Leningrad in far greater quantities than the frozen lake route had ever allowed, easing the shortages that had defined the previous winter. The breakthrough shifted the balance inside the city. Civilian rations rose, factories resumed production, and Leningrad's defenders began rebuilding their depleted units. After so many years of suffering, survival was no longer in question.